Hello and welcome. I'm Alex Izurieta. I'm from UNCTAD. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this session of the summer school organized jointly with INET. And in this one, we'll be approaching trade and development, and obviously from a South-North perspective. And the persons who are going to illuminate us on this are Amitava Dutt, Fiona Tregenna, and Guilherme Magacho. We will start with Amitava Dutt, who is Professor of Economics and Political Science at Notre University, and he will tackle the issue from the perspective of North-South paradigm revisited. So Amitava, it is over to you now.
Can you see my presentation screen? No? So I hope okay, I'm sorry about the delay. I hope the presentation screen can now be seen. Yes? Right? Okay. So the topic, as Alex said, that I will speak on is international trade with the North-South paradigm revisited. And why revisited? Because there was quite a lot of activity on North-South paradigm or North-South theories and models some time back, and perhaps it's the time is opportune to revisit that paradigm. So my talk will be mostly about the UNCTAD approach to trade and development, but specifically from the North-South perspective, which is my topic. Now, in doing that, I will proceed in 5 steps, provide maybe 5 minutes for each to make it easy. The first, which I will probably cut short, is on what is called mainstream neoclassical trade theories. I assume that most of the students here have already been exposed to these theories, perhaps even overexposed. So I will briefly touch on them and then provide some very brief criticisms of the mainstream trade theories. There is a lot to say on this, but again, I'll cut it short. Then I will talk about some heterodox trade and development theories, early ones, then briefly discuss the UN global policy model, and then talk about the North-South perspective and model. So really, I don't get to my actual topic till the last part. I can't hear anything, so if I make any jokes, I don't know whether it's funny or not, or even whether you can hear me. I don't know if that's the way it's supposed to be. Alex, is that um, everything else is shut off except me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
So, but things can be seen, right? So,
Mhm.
okay, very good. Thank you. All right, so here is a picture, a graph, actually, just a table. It's not a graph of the mainstream theories. And what I've done here is um, within one screen, uh, show you what are the most important features in terms of the features and assumptions, what they say about the determinants of trade, what they say about the consequences of trade, and just mention the main authors who have contributed to this. Um, in my screen, parts of the picture are being screen are actually been blocked out, but maybe it's not the same in your screen. Okay, so the five main theories that are discussed in mainstream or what I call neoclassical trade theories are first the Ricardian theory, which, as you know, is with one factor of production, labor, and in simple models, two products, fixed labor productivity, and labor moves across sectors but not across countries, and you have perfect competition and full employment. And as you know, the determinants of trade are primarily labor productivity, the comparative advantage. So, whoever has a comparative advantage in the production of a particular good will export that good, and the other good will be exported by the other country, even if somebody has a absolute advantage in both. And generally, you have complete specialization and gains from trade, unless you're a very large country and your terms of trade happens to be the same as your autarkic price ratio. And the general result is gains from trade due to higher utilities. So the textbooks tell us the utilities are sometimes specified to be about individuals, but also represents countries. And of course, the main author of this is supposed to be David Ricardo, but it is not clear that if he really subscribed to this view. So one must give credit to the, or maybe discredit to the textbook writers in modern neoclassical textbooks. Uh, Now, I won't go through the details of the others, but just very briefly, Hexture-Olin Samuelson theory basically changes from one factor labor alone to two inputs. The inputs are often called capital and labor, sometimes called labor and land, sometimes called high skilled and low skilled labor. And you have constant returns to scale, diminished returns to factors. Countries have identical technologies. The factors are perfectly mobile within the country, but not across borders. And there's full employment with flexible prices. And of course, as you know, that the determinants of trade here are determined by factor abundance. So if one country is abundant in one factor, let's say high skilled labor is abundant in the United States compared to, say, China, then if you look at goods that are more um, skilled labor intensive, that will be the US exports, and the low skilled labor intensive exports will go from China. And again, for most of these models, you have incomplete specialization and generally gains from trade. You also have what Samuelson called factor price equalization. There could be distributional effects within countries that hurt one factor and help another factor by affecting the relative price of that. for, as discussed by Stolper Samuelson and so forth. Um, Now, it is often forgotten that many of these models uh, actually also introduce what are called distortions of various kinds. And these distortions can actually change the result, and uh, they can do so in ways that are very similar to some of the ideas of the heterodox economists. For example, there could be production externalities, let us say, or there could be some sort of dualism and labor market imperfections and so on. So the main authors are Heckscher, um, uh, Olin, and Samuelson. The Ricardo Weiner theory, which I've never been a great fan of, but is basically three factors. One factor mobile between the sectors in the two countries, and that factor is usually labor. And then you have a fixed or specific factor, which is used only in one of the industries. Uh, so, for example, it could be land in agriculture or capital in manufacturing. And this is true of, and the rest of the model is identical to the Heckscher and Samuelson theory. In fact, some people have even interpreted this to be a short run version of the long run Heckscher theory, where in the short run, the specific factor is specific to a sector, but in the longer run, it moves. So here it's like if capital is fixed in the short run, it can become capital in the other sector in the long run. The assumptions are similar, and the consequences are similar. Then you have, of course, the new trade theory developed by Paul Krugman and Elhanan uh, Helpman and others, where what is important is scale economies, imperfect competition, differentiated products, but you still have full employment. So you might say these are getting closer to reality because they actually look at um, um, the fact that you have might have scale economies internal to the firm, and of course, as you know, perfect competition, which is the standard approach of the earlier three models, cannot sustain itself there. Um, so this leads to determinants of trade by preferences of people, technology, and even history of who is specialized in what to start with. Consequences of trade are generally gains, not only due to, say, scale economies, where each country can specialize in a different good and the world can benefit from specialization, but also because some of these models allow product variety. And neoclassical economists often think that variety is the spice of life. So um, you can gain from that. However, there can be losses because of scale economies. So a country can forge ahead and produce more by, say, import protection, as Krugman argued once, and improve its technology, or at least its productivity level, and then become an exporter of that product. Now, new trade theory, as far as I know, there's no new trade theory yet, but new trade theory focuses on the firm, the heterogeneity of producers within industry, also imperfect competition, incomplete contracts, firm-specific assets, and also that firms' exports have fixed costs. Um, and here there could be gains due of trade due to higher productivity of trading firms, but also this theory is important because it shows how poorer countries might have barriers in the presence of trying to increase exports because of high fixed costs and lacking the necessary firm-specific assets. The classic reference is by Mellets. Okay, now there are many problems, and I'll just give you a selected few that even though you have these models applied to North-South questions, um, especially here you look at, say, the Heckscher-Rollin-Samuelson model, a well-known one by Adrian Wood, quite a few years back. Um, but these models basically treat the two countries as being very similar in structure, um, and basically the action is due to factor abundance. So, for example, Wood considered the North rich countries to be abundant in high skilled labor, and the interest mainly was to show how globalization could, but need not, increase inequality between high skilled and low skilled workers in the North. But of course, the model would imply just the opposite in the South, where high skilled, low skilled labor would increase its wage. Now, um, uh, another big problem, of course, these models, without even saying so, assume full employment. In fact, it's just assumed that, of course, there's full employment. So if there's a problem with one sector and you cannot export that good, all the labor will be employed in the other sector. Uh, through wage flexibility and perfect mobility. So one specific issue here, of course, is that there's no role for aggregate demand and unemployment, which might result from uncertainty. And in fact, um, many of these mainstream models, they assume if countries are small, they can sell any amount of any good at the going market price. So, which means that if they are price competitive, which they will be due to lower wages, then there is never going to be an aggregate demand problem because you can sell those goods in foreign markets. Because you're a small country, but that cannot affect the price. These, of course, are big problems. Then the other problem is that trade theory is mostly about um, Alex. Time is running out, right? Um, okay, so I wish somebody could tell me how I'm doing in terms of time.
We need to speed it up. I'm trying to get permission from Claire to extend your time in a bit, but it would be very interesting if you move forward. Yes.
Okay. So two other points are that there's micro and macro is distinguished. This is all micro based on microeconomic theories. There is absence or limited role for dynamic effects like technological change and capital accumulation, and the gains from trade are in terms of utility and getting more goods and services. Um, Let me just mention here, heterodox trade theory has a long tradition. Mercantilists Adam Smith and Ricardo were different. Ricardo himself was different from the textbook Ricardian, and then there are imperialist authors, Marx and his followers, Hobson, Nauroji from India, later structuralists, early ones Hamilton, List, and Runnerday, and Singer and Prebisch, of course, and then you have the dependency school, which is more radical than the structuralists. Now, the UN Global Policy Model is, of course, an empirical model, and it has, as far as I know, 25 sectors, 25 regions of the world, and it's basically based on aggregate demand and leakages and injections to aggregate demand, which results in lending and borrowing by governments, countries, and so on, relate stocks and flows, stocks of deficits or surpluses, and um, changes in assets, and international capital flows. Aggregate supply also enters. Income distribution is considered to be important by affecting aggregate demand and so on. And it is quite flexible. Now, the North-South perspective looks at the world as North, the blue, and the South, the red, with honorary North being Australia and so forth. Um, now, um, the North-South perspective, since I don't have much time, is basically uh, uh, questions the whole idea of the neoclassical theories by saying that it's not the same structure everywhere. Okay, there are two broad kinds of models. One which is symmetrical in the sense of not considering structural differences, but involves increasing returns to scale in some sectors, maybe manufacturing or high skill sectors. And what this leads to is a country with a region with a slightly higher amount of capital accumulation actually can get ahead due to improved technology, even with the standard assumptions. And this tells us about how uneven development can start and build on itself through technological dynamism. So it doesn't matter. It does matter which good you export, and that matters because of manufacturing gives you some advantage due to more capital to begin with. And if this doesn't tell us how this starts, how do the small difference starts, and it people have looked at historical events like imperialism and the so-called drain of resources or slave trade to set the whole thing going. Now, the structuralist models actually are structuralist because they look at the global structure of two regions, usually having two goods which are different kinds. Maybe one is more primary goods or simple consumption goods. The other is goods that actually are more technologically sophisticated. But beyond that, the structures of the two different regions can be quite different. For example, aggregate demand might enter the north, whereas in the south you might have more Marxian kind of situation. And some of these are discussed in a book that I wrote many years ago, but which I didn't put on the reading list because well, old is not so good, but also I'm not allowed to put a book in to the reading list. Uh, these models look at terms of trade. They can look at short run, long run dynamics, possible steady states, and then look at the possibility of uneven development due to asymmetries. For example, due to which goods are exported by which region, what technological change they result in, due to the income elasticities of demand being very different. There's Thirlwall's balance of payments models, which shows how low-income countries, if they cannot increase the exports due to low demand in elasticities, they cannot get foreign exchange for actually imports and for growth. Uh, you can have growth divergence due to technological change, due to uh, loss of intermediate exports, and you can also bring in capital movements and so on. So let me now just end. I'm probably over my time a little bit, or maybe a lot. So structuralist approaches, north-south especially, allow micro macro linkages, can bring in aggregate demand issues very clearly. They bring in distributional issues within countries. You have workers, capitalists, you can have other groups too. They're easily extendable to allow for capital flows because they're not like microeconomic theory. You incorporate balance of payments, unemployment. You can also incorporate technological change. technology transfers. Now, some people have said these models are not very good because they have only two goods, and countries are completely specialized. This is a misunderstanding because Hexture-Olin, when it says there are two goods and both countries can export both goods, is just comparative advantage that allows one to focus on one. It actually assumes that manufactured goods, if that's one of them, is the same for both the countries. And for the North and South, except for a few countries, this is not quite the case. One can extend two regions to more, for example, North, the emerging South, and the South. The paper that I referred to builds on this, the one by Demir and Dahi, and raise questions like, will this continue uneven development? Is China and Africa's relationship again like the old North-South relation, or is there possibilities of South-South cooperation in terms of skill formation and technology transfers? You can also include production networks, value chains, and FDI into these models quite easily by countries joining production networks and intermediate goods. We can talk about that later if the need arises. Uh, and finally, I think the most important issue is one should focus on development. Trade is not the issue. The issue is development, whatever you mean now by that. And the North-South models focus on uneven development, where the two countries' capital formation grows at different rates, and not on utility, not on globalization per se, but we still need to think in more detail about what we mean by development, the environmental issues, pandemics now. You can see what happens to life satisfaction, insecurity, inequality. I have a few other things listed there. So one needs to rethink what we mean by development. And some of my colleagues who focus on growth according to the northern approach, where basically you have shopping malls and skyscrapers, and that's the index of development, should be rethought. And I think that the new trade theory is correct to the extent that much of the focus in trade of southern countries will have to relate to firms because of issues like firm specific capital, and may be connected to FDI much more closely. Thank you.
Well, thank you really very much, Amitava. This was really a very good overview. It's impossible to deal with all these things in a short session. We acknowledge that, and I must, out of my own personal experience, insist on showing this book. Let me see if I put my video on. Which is, I think, the one you referred before, Growth, Distribution, and Uneven Development. It was written in the 90s and still continues, still written in the 90s, continues to revisit the North-South relationships through trade, as well as through the dynamics of the different macroeconomic structures. It is a very useful insight into these issues. And I just arranged a new last message, which is that the real issue is not trade, but development. And trade can be made functional to development, provided that a number of other things are put in place. One of them is the ability of countries to industrialize. And so we have with us Fiona Tregenna, who is professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg, and who has been working on these issues very much. And now she's going to present us with her approach to the relationship between trade and industrialization. Fiona, you're welcome.
Thanks very much, Alex, and to the organizers. I'm really happy to be here again this year at the summer school, and to share my presentation this afternoon. As Alex said, I'm going to be talking about trade and industrialization. I think it follows quite well from the really deep and overarching presentation that we just listened to. And this one will be a bit more applied. Since it's such a broad topic of trade and industrialization, I decided just to zoom in on 5 issues within that, which I will be structuring my talk around this afternoon. Firstly, looking at the issue of global value chains, GVCs in relation to industrialization. Secondly, a kind of set of issues around comparative advantage, capabilities, and upgrading. And I'll speak about this broadly, and then just present some findings from a recent paper on that. Thirdly, looking at industrial hubs in the context of trade and industrialization. Fourthly, I'll talk a bit about trade protection liberalization in relation to industrialization, and also refer there to a paper as an example. That will lead into some kind of a bit more policy-oriented discussion. And then lastly, I just thought I'll just mention what I thought might be some kind of interesting research areas in this field, given the nature of the summer school. So firstly, to talk about the topic of GVCs and industrialization. I thought this would be important in the context of the broader theme of the session around trade and industrialization. And here I'm drawing on some work that myself and Antonio Andrione did, as well as some previous work of Antonio, as well as some thinking of Lindsay Whitfield on the topic. So GVCs are obviously not new at all, but perhaps have been increasing in importance in more recent years. So we see associated with the rise of GVCs, the growing importance of intra-industry trade in intermediate goods. What's also been referred to as vertical specialization, industrialization. And one of the kind of debates in the literature around this is the extent to which this perhaps challenges the kind of dichotomy or debates, the old debates between import substituting and export-oriented industrialization. One of the characteristics of the rise of GVCs is the very powerful role of lead firms in the GVCs, which are typically located in advanced economies, in controlling market access and flows of materials and knowledge and technology within the GVCs. So on the one hand, GVCs can make it easier for low-income countries, perhaps countries that don't have well-developed manufacturing sectors, to kind of gain a foothold within manufacturing, in the sense that countries or firms don't need to produce along the whole value chain, but can kind of gain an entry into it, particularly into the segments of the value chains with lower barriers to entry. But of course, the concomitant risk with that is getting stuck in the low value added parts of the value chains. And I wanted to talk about that in a bit more detail. So one of the arguments around this, which I'm drawing here in particular on Lindsay's thinking on this, is that getting stuck in those low value added parts of the value chain can weaken the growth pulling potential of manufacturing in developing countries in a couple of ways. Firstly, that exporting through the GVC route, where firms or countries get stuck in those particular segments, can reduce the increasing returns, which are characteristic of manufacturing and the growth pulling potential of manufacturing, can potentially weaken domestic linkages, and also weaken the links between manufacturing and innovation, which is part of the kind of engine of growth aspects of manufacturing. And that the strength of and dominance of lead firms with buying power allows those firms to some extent to capture at least some of the productivity gains from increasing returns, rather than those being captured and built on by firms at various parts of the value chain. And in this kind of instance, involvement in the final assembly activities within value chains can generate some foreign exchange and employment, which is obviously does matter, but can't really be effective in terms of driving industrialization and structural change. So it can be kind of referred to as thin industrialization. And from some of the work that Antonio and I have been doing, we've argued that, or pointed to the risk in some cases of for middle-income countries that have attempted to integrate globally through value chains, but run the risk of kind of delinking domestically and hollowing out the domestic manufacturing sector. In the kind of related literature on this, there's different strategies which have been advanced for avoiding some of these pitfalls, which I must kind of underline are not inevitable. So I think in the previous slide, I've been sort of drawing attention to some of the risks of particular types of GVC engagement, but it's obviously not an argument against involvement in GVCs at all. So one of the arguments which Kyun Lee and some of his co-authors have been putting forward is of the kind of in-out-in engagement with value chains of initial engagement to kind of gain a foothold, disengagement, so the out stage to sort of build up productive capabilities, and then re-engagement at a high level. I think also kind of there's the arguments in the literature on the importance of localization, both of production and of productive capabilities. And it's worth noting that the value chain activities with the highest barriers to entry and the most difficult to get in typically also have the highest returns. So this really highlights the importance of upgrading within GVCs. And there's different kinds of upgrading: process upgrading, product upgrading, functional upgrading, intersectoral upgrading, and so on. But broadly, we're referring to improving the ability of a firm or of an economy to move towards more profitable, more sophisticated activities and with higher value creation potential, and to capture more of the value that's created within them. This obviously requires higher capabilities thresholds, and I'll come a bit to this in the next part of my talk. And what Antonio and I have referred to as linking up while linking back. So linking up with global value chains while simultaneously linking back to the domestic economy, and this links with the local production system development. So ensuring that the linking up with GVCs is strategic and also helps to pull forward the rest of the domestic economy. So I think this leads well into the second topic that I thought I'd talk about this afternoon, which is a kind of set of issues in relation to dynamic comparative advantage, productive capabilities, innovation, technological intensity, upgrading, and so on. So in some ways, we can see dynamic comparative advantage as lying at the core of structural transformation and of the catching up process of developing to advanced economies. I think it's clear, but theoretically, empirically, historically, that sticking to comparative advantage is simply a dead end for developing countries. And I think some of the theoretical issues underpinning this have been well set out in Amitava's presentation. And industrial policy obviously has a central role to play in supporting the kind of upgrading and producing on the basis of dynamic comparative advantage. So I think some of the debates in the literature and some of the choices facing policymakers in practice around dynamic comparative advantage. It's all very well to say in practice, yeah, let's follow dynamic comparative advantage, let's defy, and so on. One is how far ahead to jump. I think some of this is explored in the debate between Hajun Chang and Justin Lin, how incremental or how far ahead of countries' kind of static or current comparative advantage profile is it feasible or strategic to jump? Yeah, I think it's not something that can be answered in theory. It's really a kind of contextual question. And perhaps a second kind of set of, sort of debates and policy choices associated with that is the difficult the difficult choices that face countries such as my own, South Africa, which have extremely high rates of unemployment, in particular, a large unskilled or semi-skilled labor supply. So where you're following an industrialization path and an industrial policy focus, which emphasizes dynamic comparative advantage, the kinds of activities which that would suggest prioritizing would typically not be the ones which are intensive in low-skilled labor, at least directly. Of course, when one factors in employment multipliers and intersectoral linkages and so on, to some extent that apparent trade-off is mitigated, because those kind of dynamic comparative advantage activities that one is targeting might also to some extent pull along some of the others. But I think it still remains a difficult policy choice for high unemployment countries, and how to balance these priorities of kind of mopping up a large supply of unskilled labor, while at the same time wanting to move in towards more technologically sophisticated activities. So in terms of productive capabilities, we see there's different concepts of this. I think the two key kind of sets of capabilities here are around production capabilities and technological capabilities. I see capabilities as very closely linked with learning, that's learning by doing, and learning more broadly, and as being key to catching up and where leapfrogging is possible, to leapfrogging, to withstanding competition from imports and for growing exports. And although I won't go into it in detail here, a recent paper published with co-authors in European Journal of Development Research, we looked at an econometric analysis of the impact of production capability, of productive capability, on the export performance of African firms using firm level data, and found a really close causal relationship. In terms of technological intensity and upgrading, I think it's kind of interlinked with this broad set of issues around upgrading, comparative advantage, capabilities, and so on. We can see innovation and technological upgrading as part of the micro foundations of structural change, and to really draw attention to the importance of this for diversification, for the upgrading in value chains that I spoke about earlier, for enhancing the complexity and sophistication of a country's manufacturing profile, and so on. And in particular, medium and high-tech industries typically are closer to the technological frontier. They often have strong spillover effects and linkages, important to competitiveness, associated with an investment in R&D and so on. And also in some recent research, we found that even where manufacturing as a whole is following a kind of deindustrialization path, but that medium and high-tech industries don't necessarily follow that same kind of classic inverted U path. They can actually increase as a share of employment or GDP across countries at high levels of income per capita. So they don't tend to level off in their shares. So this also suggests that MHT industries remain a feasible industrialization path, even for countries at high levels of income per capita. And then on the other side, of countries which are late industrializers, or even what might be called late industrializers, technological upgrading is obviously difficult, but is crucial for breaking in and for catching up. Oops, sorry. What happened here? Okay. So as part of this kind of second topic, I thought I'll just briefly share some findings from a recent working paper with two of my co-authors, Elvis Avenio and Cornelia Ngwatleka, where we look at the relationship between innovation and exports in African firms. So kind of starting from the basis that both innovation and exports are seen as important for both firms and countries' growth and development. And we econometrically investigate the two-way relationship between innovation and exports using a simultaneous estimation model. And we also interact each of these, innovation and exports, separately with foreign ownership and with certification, to having a quality certificate to investigate how each of these affects the two-way relationship between exports and innovation. So this is using firm level data from the World Bank Enterprise Survey. I think I'll skip some of this literature. And we found a really strong bidirectional relationship between innovation and export performance. And by export performance, we're referring both to the export propensity, where the firms export at all, as well as export intensity. So we found that firms can kind of what we call learn to export through innovation. So the more innovative firms are better placed to kind of break into export markets and to increase their export intensity, as well as the other way around. So interestingly, that firms that export are also more likely to innovate, and we find that both for product and process innovations. And then that foreign ownership and having a quality certification actually enhances the strength of the causal relationship in both directions as well. I think I'll just skip the policy implications and move on to the third topic, which I thought I'll talk about, which is around industrial hubs. And here I'm referring broadly to industrial development zones and different kinds of zones, industrial districts, parks, and so on. Here drawing on a chapter, myself and Chris Kramer, in the Oxford Handbook of Industrial Hubs and Economic Development. So we have looked at here, how can industrial hubs potentially strengthen the role of manufacturing as an engine of growth. So at the kind of theoretical level, hubs can, by bringing in or by intensifying the clustering and agglomeration of manufacturing firms, can potentially strengthen the growth pulling of manufacturing, particularly in countries that have a really weak or nascent manufacturing sector. They can also potentially enhance productivity of manufacturing firms, both within the hubs and beyond. Yes, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but basically looking at the various characteristics of manufacturing that are seen to position manufacturing as a kind of engine of growth from a structuralist perspective. Hubs can potentially strengthen each of those. So the learning by doing, returns to scale, backward linkages between sectors, that kind of technologically leading role of manufacturing, exports and the contribution to balance of payments and so on. So potentially, and underlining potentially, hubs can kind of deepen the role of manufacturing as an engine of growth, and particularly in countries that have a very weak manufacturing sector. So they might kind of need to be sort of clustered together in hubs. But we also really emphasize that these potential advantages are not always realized in practice. They're not automatic. And that even where hubs can kind of contribute in a static sense to generating more jobs, adding to GDP, generating foreign exchange, not to discount those can be important, but that kind of a role doesn't necessarily stimulate or support wider structural transformation. So countries need to avoid hubs operating as kind of delinked enclaves in a maquila type of model. And from a policy perspective, we suggest that hubs which base their attraction to firms on kind of exemptions from from the rest of the economy. So weaker labor standards or other kinds of standards, lower wages, extreme tax benefits, and so on, are less likely to kind of attract firms that can potentially pull along hubs and the broader economy in a more dynamic sense and contribute to upgrading and to structural transformation. So instead of just doing more of the same, doing something different. So we, as part of this, we emphasize the importance of hubs not just being comparative advantage conforming and doing more of the same that's done in the rest of the domestic economy, but at kind of being of the frontier of that domestic economy. It doesn't have to be the frontier of the world, but the frontier of what a country is doing in particular manufacturing sectors, and being sort of pushing the envelope in terms of being comparative advantage defying in order to play part of a role in a structural transformation in an economy. So yeah, practically it points to the importance of targeting more sophisticated, higher value added sectors in which in which an economy aims to become competitive, even if it's sort of at the early stages of that. And the importance of maximizing linkages with the rest of the domestic economy. And this is not just backward and forward linkages, but technological linkages, skills linkages, and so on. And treating hubs as part of a broader industrial policy, integrated with other policies rather than just kind of looking at them in isolation. How am I doing on time? I don't have it in front of me.
We are getting a bit tight, actually. We are 2 or 3 minutes just to the deadline.
Okay, let me jump some parts. Sorry about that. So yeah, so very briefly then, yeah, it's the trade protection and industrial development. Trade protection can be one of the kind of important tools in the toolbox of industrial policy and industrialization in developing countries. But what's really important is tying trade protection to the need for firms to invest, to upgrade, and so on. So basically rent management. How do you ensure that the rents which firms gain from protection are plowed back and into that kind of upgrading? Yeah, let me just skip some of this. I'm going to skip this all together. Sorry, I'm just moving quite fast now. Yeah, this is the final topic that I thought I'll talk about, and I'll go through it quite fast. So just a couple of comments on different aspects of trade policy that I thought would be important to end up with. I think from a policy perspective, it's important to see trade and a country's trade policy as a means towards other goals. And some of those goals, I think, can include inclusive and sustainable growth, reindustrialization, employment creation, reducing inequality, and so on, both domestically and inequality. Yeah, the case has been made, I think, very beautifully and clearly in the previous presentation. There are winners and losers from trade, obviously, within and between countries. And we see quite differential effects by occupation, by class, by sector, by skills, by gender, and so on. And there's a policy dimension, obviously, to this, and there are choices to be made. So trade can be structured in ways that redistribute income upwards or downwards, and those effects will be felt in people's lives. And over a long period of time, many decades, decisions around trade internationally have typically benefited the kind of haves or have-nots, in a very broad sense, and on balance have probably contributed to widening inequality. For developing countries and in particular low-income countries, I think tariffs do remain a crucial tool, but having access for their own trade to developing to the advanced economies is crucial for industrialization and growth. Yeah. maybe the final thing which I'll talk about is just links between trade policy and industrial policy. I think it's really crucial to have an integrated policy perspective on this. And when we talk about some of the topics that I've spoken of this afternoon, we can't really sort of separate where trade and industrial policy begin and end on them. Dynamic comparative advantage, productive capabilities, and so on. Maybe just the one thing which I will say here is that the sequencing of trade and industrial policy, of course, not in a linear way, but I think it's clear that just to have a sweeping tariff liberalization, as for example, in my own country, we had in the late 90s, without having really strong industrial policy and really developing strong productive capabilities and building competitiveness on firms, there's this idea that kind of the cold winds of competition will sweep through and firms will like overnight suddenly magically become more efficient. But no, many of them just closed, never to reopen. So I think having trade liberalization without industrial policy and development of capabilities first, it just kind of leads to destruction and job losses. And beyond trade and industrial policy, there's obviously a whole set of other policy areas that it doesn't make sense to look at trade or industrial policy without these. Macroeconomic policy, unless that is in coordination, you can have a great industrial policy, but it's not going to lead to any good outcomes. Innovation policy and so on. And maybe lastly, is in terms of trade agreements and trade negotiations, I think it's really crucial that countries are able to retain the power to regulate and to discipline capital, including here the power of governments over investment and capital flows, procurement, industrial policy, intellectual property, and various standards, environmental, labor and consumer, and so on. Sometimes these are treated as kind of trade barriers to be eliminated, but these are part of the role and the autonomy of governments. So that's the end of my talk. I'm just going to leave this slide up for a moment. I'm not going to go through it. I thought since it is a summer school for young scholars, I will just kind of mention here what I see as some of the kind of interesting and dynamic research areas in this field, trade and industrial development. I think some of these are areas that are not new, but I think continue to be dynamic in the literature and in policy. Others are kind of emerging areas which I think it's kind of exciting to get into, around your e-commerce, the link between digitalization and trade and so on. I think, for example, green industrialization, green industrial policy, it's not new, but it's obviously a growing area of research, and I think it's something good to. Other than that, it's important, but I think it's also maybe strategic for young scholars to get into. I'm not going to go through any of them there, but I'll send the slides, and let me leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you really very much. A lot of material here as well, Fiona, and I've been also going through the many questions. And many of the questions that were asked to you and to Amitava, they merge each other. I hope you have time in the next session to dig more into that. The burden and impression I have from your presentation, Fiona, is that trade is a very complicated story, because it is also a question of not only the technological dimensions of it, but also the policy dimensions of it, and the international policy dimensions of it, which the experts call the trade policy issues. And indeed, they linked as well to issues that were raised in many of the questions, for example, regarding South-South trade, or even regarding Samir Amin's propositions about uneven development and perhaps the linking. So there are many issues there. But there is a possible connection of your presentation, which I want to stress, with the next one, which is about how to deal with these issues of global trade, which is trade by its own nature is global, and to deal with the inherent policies around global trade in a way that absolutely requires coordination. And I think that is one of the things that emerges very clearly on the discussions about climate. And Guilherme Gamacho, who is an economist at Agence Française Développement, will help us bring in the issues of climate change into the story of trade. And I hope with also approaching it from an angle in which international policy coordination may be an important consideration to make trade work for development. Guilherme, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for the introduction. I'll share the screen here. Well, first of all, I would like to thank, besides Alex, all the INET and UNCTAD board for the invitation and for the opportunity to present these things that we are working at Agence Française de Développement. Well, this topic is especially interesting for me in presenting here in the UNCTAD INET YSI Summer School. First, because I'm a Latin American economist, and the UNCTAD was at some point responsible for bringing this discussion on North-South, this North-South paradigm, uneven development, the things that we both Tregenna and Amitava was talking. And also because of UNCTAD was responsible for bringing climate change to this discussion, because okay, we had like in the Rio 92 increasing discussion on this, but in the 80s, UNCTAD was already talking about this and talking about trade and climate change in a UNCTAD summer school. It's an honor. And also because I was coordinator of a working group at INET in the very beginning of the YSI, and seeing the size of the importance that YSI has today makes me very proud. So, well, the idea of this presentation, it's not working. Okay, yeah. Basically, what I'll talk to you is a little bit on this discussion of decoupling the South, which is the main issue that we're talking at AFD, at Agence Française de Développement, because the North is okay for like, it's possible, it's much easier to do it in the North and in the South. And for many reasons, for like financial reasons, although there are some issues in the North, there are many issues, much more relevant issues in the South. And first, I will present a little bit on the climate policy, climate political economy, the Paris Agreement, how it changes and why it's important to look at the Paris Agreement, how it's different from the Kyoto Protocol, all the very important dimensions. Talk a little bit on this decoupling the South, the importance of these. To what extent climate change and structural change are very closely things, like they are very related, and discuss a little bit on the policies that are being taken and the directions that these policies and the range of policies that we have, and how you can model, discuss, and analyze them. Well, the main objective of the Paris Agreement is to keep the climate damage as low as possible. So we already had like, it's not reached yet, but we will have in the current conditions 2 degrees increase in the world temperature. And the Paris Agreement is trying to, okay, let's keep it in 2% or as close as possible to 1.5%. And how to do this? Basically, the idea is to get to the net zero CO2 emissions and drastically reducing the emissions of other GHG, the other greenhouse gases. Why? And why it's important to look at the net zero, not only zero, because of course you can, you need to, and thinking about like 2015, 2050, sorry, you need to reach this, you need to produce some CO2 yet. It's impossible to think about reduce, but you can create some compensations. It's not the ideal. The idea is that to reach the zero, proper zero in 2100, but it's more realistic to think about net zero in 2015. The most important, the leading cause of GHG emissions are, of course, energy, transportation. So energy, especially the energy from fossil fuels, and transportation, because you need to burn fossil fuels for transportation. And of course, if you move for electric vehicles or public electric vehicles, so like trains and so on, it's a great opportunity to reduce this. But also provision of food is also a very important, especially the other GHG emissions besides CO2, methane, the methane gas. It's a very important one in the production of food, and also deforestation, which sometimes is not considered in some statistics, but it has two impacts. First, you are destroying the forest, and by destroying the forest, you are emitting CO2, emitting other gases, but also because by destroying the forest, you are reducing the natural carbon reducers, which is like the forest and all the other natural environments. And to decarbonize the world, let's say, you need parallel and not only direct. There is this pillars of decarbonization, and the interesting thing is that they are parallel. At the same time, you need to decarbonize the production of electricity, and you need to undertake massive electrifications. If you do one and not do the other, if you only decarbonize the production of electricity, it will be not enough. And if you just have like massive electrification, for producing electricity, you are burning coal. Basically, it's not working. So you need to do everything together. For example, increasing public and non-motorized transportation. Of course, the private transportation, if everyone use your own car, it's not sustainable. Deforestation has to reduce. Especially here, this last one is especially interesting because sometimes it seems that yesterday I was in a conference and we were discussing this. They said, okay, industrialization is a problem because it increases the CO2 emissions, the GHG emissions. It's not true. Depends on what kind of industrialization. Manufacturing itself is a sector it's very heterogeneous. So there are some industries, or even within industries, you have different methods to produce. So basically, it's important to improve the efficiency within sectors, not only move from sectors that are high pollutants to low pollutants. Well, this is a graph that I found. It was published in the Nature review. And it's interesting because it shows what happens if you do not do anything, what happens if the countries do what they are doing nowadays, what happens if they are doing what they tend to do, and what they need to reduce to the 2 degree, which is the first objective of the Paris Agreement, and the 1.5 degrees, which is the most interesting objective, the most interesting goal of the Paris Agreement. So how far we are in terms of CO2 emissions in gigatons here, CO2 equivalent emissions? Well, we're very far from this. If we're continuing doing what they say, business as usual, if we're continuing doing what we are doing, it's insane how the world will collapse. And it's collapsing. If you're doing what we're doing nowadays, which is somewhat interesting, it's not enough. If you do what the countries intend to do, it's not enough yet. So we have to move much forward from this. And this is from each sector, which one they are producing, just to illustrate here how other gases besides CO2 is important. This is Brazil. And Brazil has it's a very important country in terms of, among these countries here, is the most important in terms of production of crops and livestock and food in general. And this is other gases, which is not CO2. And if you look at other gases besides CO2, the story becomes even more complicated. So the idea is that we need agriculture, but we need a different kind of agriculture. Well, decarbonization, all this discussion of the process of reducing CO2, they have asymmetric impacts on the economy. And this is interesting because basically there will be some statistics show that some models are showing that the net impact is positive. Okay, for employment, for example, there will be net generation of employment. There will be more employment generated than destroyed. Well, but most of the employments that are destroyed are in these two sectors: fossil fuel electricity and fossil fuel extraction, and animal-based food production. So the countries that depends on these industries, the economies that depends on these industries are those that are more vulnerable, or at least more exposed to these impacts. New employments will be generated. Of course, there will be employments in many other sectors, the renewable energy sectors, like building machinery, inputs for renewable energy. Those countries that produce this kind of goods will generate employment. So if in the summation, we have like a net generation of employment, if you produce fossil fuels, you are losing employment. If you are producing renewable energy, you are gaining employment. So the impact will be, the net impact for each country depends on the structure of the country, the structure of production. And this North-South relation, we'll see, it's crucial to understand the diversity of these impacts. Also, agriculture and plant-based food production. The animal-based is expected to reduce in terms of, it's what sometimes they said, a sunset industry, with an industry that is reducing or will reduce in terms of the share of production, because the ecological or the low carbon transition is not very different from the other structural change that we have in history, but it's a very fast one, because these industries are expected to disappear. For example, in the first industrial revolution or the second industrial revolution, we had some industries that emerged and some industries that disappeared, or if not disappear, they lose importance, at least relatively. But the thing is, when we're talking about like the ecological transition, we know what are the industries that will disappear. We know, because we know which are the industries that that suffer more from, that produce more using CO2, generating CO2, even if it is the industry itself, or if it is embodied in the inputs that the industry use. For example, steel industry. Steel industry is not a very produce. It is also, but the most important thing that makes the steel industry a sunset industry, maybe, or at least a high emission industry, is the fact that it uses a lot of electricity. And if the electricity is generated by coal, definitely this is industries with very, very high emission, not because of the industry itself, but because of the process of production. Well, the thing is, as I was saying, although the net impact is positive, the process of transition matters. Why? Because there will be a lot of displaced workers. There will be a lot of new jobs in some industries, and a lot of jobs that will be destroyed in others. So these workers that are in these industries that are being destroyed, especially if you have like regions, not necessarily maybe within a country, you can have these. You have regions that depends on these industries here, these high carbonized sectors. Basically, these workers that work for these industries will face the unemployment. So we can have like a socioeconomic issue. As I was saying, differ across countries and across regions within countries as well. So fossil fuel dependence, if you take, we're going to see which are the countries that are the most impacted ones. But basically, the fossil fuel dependent countries are those that are more vulnerable and more exposed to this transition. And there is another issue which is quite complicated, especially with if you're thinking about developing countries. Developing countries need to import a lot of this renewable energy machinery and need to import a lot of inputs. For example, the agriculture need to be more machinery intensive, to be more productive, to not need for any deforestation for expansion. So you need to invest a lot. We need to spend a lot of, as Amitava was saying about the Tiro model, it's very clear that you need to import to growth. If you need to import to growth, think about a developing country that cannot produce machineries that are high technological, cutting edge, and the cutting edge technology. They need to import a lot to growth. But if they need to import, they need to export. But the problem is, if they cannot export because they produce fossil fuels, if they produce food, especially for meat, what happens is that they are losing capacity to export and losing capacity to import. So growth in the long term will be damaged. So the transition process matters in socioeconomic terms, in external terms, and also in fiscal terms. There is the need for a lot of investment, public investment, for this transition to happen. But how to finance this? How governments can finance? They can emit green bonds. There are many discussions on how they can finance this ecological transition, and this is something especially important for developing countries. I'll bring a little bit on this discussion on the North and South, because this is especially interesting when we're thinking about the ecological transition or the low carbon transition. Here is the CO2 emissions, the total CO2 emissions in the North, and total CO2 emissions in the South. Basically, what we have is like the North is decoupling, and the South is like more and more producing. The graph here ends up in 2009, but more recent, this is, they use, like, this study was published in the Economic System Research. They use the YOD database, and at that time it finished in 2009. But still, we still have like these estimates for the recent data, and still the emissions in the South is still growing, and the emissions in the North, if it is not reduced, at least it is stable, which is extremely important. But the thing is, like, the main issue that I want to transmit with this graph is, like, okay, the decoupling thing is a South thing, is mainly a South thing. Decoupling the North is like okay to do, it's possible to do, but decoupling the South, and especially when you're thinking about like countries that are growing very fast, it's extremely difficult to do. There is no chance of having like a zero growth economies in the South, basically because zero growth means that a lot of people will be under the poverty line. So basically, you cannot just stop growing. You can keep growing, and you need to keep growing, because this transition has to be inclusive. It has to be green and inclusive. Well, this is the intensity coefficients of CO2 emissions. So is the CO2 emissions per dollar. Why this is interesting? First, although the South is, as we're seeing in the last graph, is increasing the total CO2 emissions, it's decreasing very fast intensity, the CO2 emission intensity. So for units of dollar that they're producing, they are reducing a lot the CO2 emissions. Of course, it's not enough to reduce the total CO2 emissions, but it's extremely important, because now at least you are producing more, using less, producing less CO2 and CO2 equivalents. The other thing is that the South and the North are completely different scales in terms of emission. The North emits much less than the South. Even if you compare here is like it's 3 times more in the South than in the North, about 3 times. Which means that if you're increasing, and this is something that we're going to look more deep into, if you're increasing the production in the South and decreasing the production in the North, there is a structural change where we are moving from the non-producers of CO2 to the producers of CO2. If a country, for example, stop producing, like a North country, Europe, one country in Europe, stop producing in the country and start producing or buying inputs from the South, what happens that basically they are moving from a very low, not very low, but at least a lower production system to a lower emission production system to a higher emission production system, which means that although the country itself is reducing the CO2 emissions, for the world in general, it's not necessarily true. And this is the pollution heaven hypothesis, basically outsourcing production, which is basically tertiarizing, or like stop producing in your country, start producing in a developing country. Although it's like profitable activity, outsourcing activities, for example, shipping for seeking for cheap labor or cheaping resources, it's interesting from the point of view of the firm. It's interesting from the point of view of the country. Sometimes it's not necessarily interesting from the point of view of a green transition. Why? Because developing countries tend to have less stringent environmental regulations. Basically, these developing countries, they are more flexible in terms of the environmental regulations. And there is also an issue, which is they are forced to have low environmental regulation or less stringent environmental regulation to attract foreign direct investments. So if you want to attract investment, you have to reduce your environmental regulations. So it's a little bit like going exactly against the ideas that we're discussing before. The idea of the Paris Agreement, which is like the world have to work together. The world needs to. There is not. It's not a one country do it by yourself and let the world, because of course, like the climate impact is not concentrated in one country. If I emit in my country, the other country or the neighbors or all the world around will be impacted. So there is no such thing as like doing it by myself for myself. So I need to do it in a world that work together. So this pollution heaven hypothesis is basically looking at these ideas, like looking at these problems that can emerge from these. And of course, the empirical evidence on this pollution heaven hypothesis is a little bit controversial. Even though there is all these issues, there are some works that shows that in the case of Europe, they are transferring more emissions than value added, which means that you are increasing, basically you are moving in the two lines that we're discussing before, you are moving from the blue line to the red line, from the north line to the south line. And there, on the other hand, of course, you have some authors that argue that this is not as important as the things that are happening within countries. In the case of US, for example, Levinson shows that the shifting pollution overseas explain only a minor part of the reduction of emissions in the US. Most of the reduction of emission in the US is not due to outsourcing, but due to change in the structural change or change in the methods of production. Well, going a little bit more on this structural change and the size of the problem that we're dealing, this paper here, it's actually it's a book chapter. They show basically the importance of structural change for reducing the consumption, the emission of CO2. And there is this difference between production-based and consumption-based, which is basically looking at the production-based is like, okay, what country is producing the CO2 emissions for the country? And the consumption-based, it's that, okay, I'm consuming some good that embodies a lot of emissions before I'm buying, for example, a computer, and a computer doesn't have like a car, and this car has a lot of steel, and this steel was produced in another country. But when I compute the consumption-based CO2 emissions, I compute the emissions produced in the other country in my country, because I'm considering the goods I'm consuming, not goods I'm producing. So it's another way of measuring this. But what I want to focus here is this difference here, which is like the total change in production based in emissions, basically, and the change due to structural change. So basically what happens is that countries in general are growing very fast, especially in the south, but the structural change is preventing these growth to generate emissions. So basically this blue line could be the growth in emissions like base one. So it should be like in 12 years, yeah, 12 years, a 60% growth of GDP per capita. If there is no reduction on the emission intensity, what would happen is that the total emissions will increase, total emissions per capita will increase by 60%. But what happened is that there were a change in the world structure of production, and the structure of production is responsible for reducing by about, depending on the way you measure it, the consumption-based measures, reduced by 40% this impact, which means that the structural change, basically the role of the structural change was essential for guaranteeing that the world is not collapsing, or maybe it's collapsing more slowly than we could expect. So basically, what we have here is that the production-based or the consumption-based both are showing that the emissions are, although our emissions are increasing, they are decreasing due to the structural change, because countries are reducing the use of, reducing the production and reducing the consumption of sunset industries. The thing is, and this is what this graph that we're working now at AFD shows. The thing is, there are many countries that depend on these sunset industries, these industries that will disappear, like fossil fuels, there are many others, like the most important, and as you can see from the name of the countries here, they are mostly dependent on fossil fuels. So here you have Algeria, Libya, Angola, Iraq, Venezuela, Kuwait, Russia, Iran. These are countries that are, these countries in the vertical axis, is showing this, are countries that depend on these sunset industries to raise foreign currency. So basically what we have here is that we have exports. Sorry, how I am with the time. I don't know. I'm finishing right now in a few minutes. Well, these countries here are those that depend the most of the sunset industries, and they are the most vulnerable countries. And there are some, I'm going to this one because I think it's more clear. These are the same countries in the vertical axis, but this is the global green complexity potential. So these countries that are in the right side of this graph are those that, although they may have, for example, Russia, Norway, and Iran, although they are extremely exposed to the ecological or low carbon transition, they can easily move to other sectors because they have more complex economies and they have more green complex economies. While these countries here are extremely vulnerable, and all the issues that we're discussing about the problems that will emerge during the transition problems that will emerge in the low carbon transition will happen with these countries here, because they will not, first, they depend a lot on these industries, and second, they cannot easily move from these industries to another. For example, if you take India, India is here, it's relatively high dependent on the sunset industries, but it's a country that has all the capabilities to move to technological and productive capabilities to move to other industries. Well, going more deeply into the discussion on the measures, and I think this is especially interesting because we show that there are many differences between the measures that can be adopted. Here is the carbon tax, which is usually seen as the solution for all problems. But the problem with carbon tax is that it's a very recessive, and the thing with aggregate demand that Amitava was saying is that affect exactly this. because carbon tax you are taking money out of the economy, you are reducing, you are taxing who emits the most. Even though it has a positive impact in terms of fiscal revenue, it has a very negative impact in terms of aggregate demand. So countries will face, and especially those countries that depend most on these industries, will face the most important issues with these industries, with this ecological transition. More recently, there is this border carbon adjustment discussion in Europe, and I would like to bring a little bit on this, because the idea is that, okay, it works like a carbon price, like you are taxing industries that emit the most, or sectors or countries that emit the most. But what you do here is that it's an extension of this from domestic to imported ones. So the idea is that you are taxing more countries that emit the most. So there is like, and this is especially interesting because it's possible that it's going to be implemented not this year. It's been discussed in the European Parliament and everything. There are many issues with this. Basically, first, there is a problem that goes completely against the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is basically the main idea of the Paris Agreement, which says that, okay, countries cannot contribute equally to the low carbon transition. Countries like Algeria cannot contribute as France, because Algeria depends a lot on exports of fossil fuels. These BCAs, sometimes they are not effective because the models that they show that they are effective assume high elasticity of substitution, because you're taxing carbon and say, okay, by taxing carbon, countries will move from one product to another, or will reduce CO2 emissions. But basically, you're assuming that they will be able to do so. And definitely, most of these countries that we are seeing before, they are not able to do so, to do this. Okay, maybe India can do this, Norway can do this, but most of them cannot. Just they not easily move to these other segments. Besides the technical problems of measuring these, and this is, I just brought from the UNCTAD new report on trade and green trade, actually. And basically what they discuss is maybe reducing the negative impacts of these BCAs. They could be implemented basically first, like step by step, phased first in these more developed countries, these countries that can move from fastly to these non-emission sectors, non-emission industries. Could apply first in commodities that is easy to measure the carbon intensity, and this is the most complicated one, the revenue, because it's a taxation. So you can you have revenues from BCAs. They can be used to finance low carbon investment in the vulnerable countries, because you have a lot of countries that you need to move, and they don't have resources for financial resources to move through these. So basically, there are alternatives. We're not saying that there is okay, the only way to do these, and or you do or you not. Either you do or you not do. But you can do, but it has to be in a responsible way, thinking about these vulnerable countries. So this is another way of doing this, and not going to this. So basically, this is. Sorry for going a little bit about the time.
Well, thank you very much, Guilherme. You started with trade and transportation, deforestation to increase food production. Then this leads to CO emissions. And you walk us through CO emissions and the problems of limiting climate change. And at the end of the day, we go back to finance, which is the subject of tomorrow's session, which you are most welcome, everybody, to attend. That is tomorrow at this same time of today. And you also brought back, from the perspective of the environment and climate change, the same issues that nag every economist and policy making agent in the developing world in particular, goes back to the issue of how to negotiate agreements like the border carbon agreements that actually start with good intentions and may constrain developing countries even further from their own development strategies. And that is the eternal question that needs to be resolved for trade and for climate change mitigation to work for development. I'm afraid we don't have much time. There were a number of very interesting questions to the three speakers, but the bottom line is there are issues to be resolved at the theoretical level, but they are the most important constraints seem to emerge at the level of policy, at the level of finance. And this, therefore, requires that young scholars, like the ones participating in this summer school, start thinking heavily on how to combine these developments in terms of research towards developments in terms of effective policy to contribute to economic development, which is at the end what concerns the summer school. So with that, I must thank all the speakers again for their very abundant presentations, which require a lot of time from us all to digest, and to Annette for joining us in organizing this summer school. And then, yes, we are going to have a very short break, the way I understand it. And from here, we're going to continue the conversation, which I hope that the speakers will have the ability and the time to answer already difficult questions that I've seen passing in front of my screen. So thank you very much to all, and until tomorrow then. Bye-bye.